It's not because Christianity recommends, X, Y, and Z, but it's through Christianity that we become great.
They condemn racism, but they only condemn whites who happen to be racist.
And in a way, God is just whatever it is that keeps our civilization going.
White people are constantly being told that race is a social construct. It's not even biological.
And you think, where do you belong? Yeah, you belong in a shopping mall. There's nothing to you other than that.
All right, so I'm here with Ryan Dawson, who is I guess you would say he's a truther. He's an author and a documentary filmmaker. He's got his website over there, ANC, which is Anti-Neocon Report. And so he does podcasts. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his work. And we wanted to talk today about something that we had a disagreement on. I'm going to save that for a little bit, just because this is the first time he's been on the channel, and I just want to talk to him. So how are you doing, Ryan?
I'm not bad, man. It's really cold. I had to put a jacket on. Got my End All Aid to Israel hoodie though.
Oh, excellent.
Yep.
It's cold here
This
too.
We don't have this anymore, but where are you, by the way?
I'm in the States.
US?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for coordinating, half on different hemispheres and everything. So,
are you in real America or are you in the Northeast?
I'm not in the South, I'll tell you that. But
yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to, because we do have a lot of things in common, and you are a nationalist. I wanted to know, first of all,
that's on the rise too. You see that? Italy, France, Belgium, it's happening.
It's exciting, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of different.
Get rid of this international crap.
Exactly,
Yep.
Exactly. So I wanted to know, though, because what separates you from a lot of people is your focus on the Zionist issue, and you certainly have called out people in the past for being, big Zionists, big lovers of Israel. Why is it that you focus so much on that issue?
Well, I think if you're going to call yourself a nationalist from the United States and you care about American interest, then you got to look around and see, why have we spent over $6 trillion in the Middle East, right? Why did we have this war in Iraq, Syria, and Libya? And the consequences of Libya and Syria have been refugees pouring into Europe, which hurts our economic trading partners, and it hurts the European anyway. And obviously it hurts the people we blew to pieces. And this isn't an American value to go start wars of choice. It's not supposed to be. I mean, it definitely has been, but it's not something I oppose. I don't equate nationalism and patriotism as the same thing. I mean, what's in American interest, what's going to improve the American quality of life, is to not be spending trillions of dollars on a parasitic state that uses deception to get the United States engaged in wars in the Middle East. That's one thing it's doing to hurt the United States. And there's a long list of things. You've heard me rattle them off. So the Zionist influence is our problem. I see people get so over-focused on whatever, like immigration or this tax or that. I mean, look, that's not who owns
just to
the
stop
Fed,
you though. I like someone could play devil's advocate. I could play devil's advocate and say, all nations have had atrocities and so on throughout in their founding and their history. So why is Israel different, or why is that a bigger problem?
Israel's new, and we decided after World War I that annexing territory is a bad idea, because what happened when they stole, and they did steal land from Germany, and they took the Rhinelands and they made a Danzig corridor, and these are German-speaking, culturally German people living in what's now a piece of Poland or a piece of France, and you can't just arbitrarily mesh people in like that. Multiculturalism doesn't work. So it led to World War II is what it led to. So we decided in the Geneva Conventions that annexing territory, even when you win a war, is a bad idea. And then rolled over and Israel annexed Palestine. All of Israel was annexed from a a nation that already existed, already full of people, already with a completely different culture, and they stuck a bunch of Europeans in the middle of the Middle East. And of course, it's been a fucking disaster with conflict. And I wouldn't want the opposite to happen either. I wouldn't want a bunch of Middle Easterners to colonize any Western state either. It's a stupid concept from its outset, and you have these religious zealots that think, well, God gave us this land, and according to my fictional stories, we were here 3,000 years ago, where a king killed a giant with a sling, and thus this is now my dirt, and I can bulldoze down a home and shoot a child and burn his olive trees. Like, it's a paper-thin justification for wholesale murder and genocide. And saying, like, well, lots of countries have done bad things with their founding. It's like, yeah, lots of cities have murder, too. We don't just say, oh, well, like, we arrest the murderers. Like, when you commit crimes, you pay punishment. Even if they're inevitable, even if they're widespread, that doesn't make it all right. It was bad every time it's happened.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people want to justify, oh, white people did something to the Native Americans, therefore it's okay to do
white
this.
People did not do something to Native Americans. Governments did something to Native Americans.
Okay, yeah.
Because, like, if you say white people, all right, what did the Irish do to the Indians? What did the Polish do to the Indians? What did the Russians do? All these places are white, and Ireland also got colonized by the British, as did many places, you know. That was a government. That's what monarchies tend to do, is kill their neighbors and things. They killed other white people just as much. The French and the British and the Spanish all fought with each other, all fought with their neighbors. This was the result of a tyrannical government and religious zealotry, you know, whether it was the Catholic brand or the Protestant brand or whatever. That's how they behave to each other too. And then they come to the Americas. They lost in the beginning, but the pathogens from Europe ended up killing most of the Indians, about 90%. And then, yeah, a lot of horrible things happened from government. I mean, the state government of California, this is late in the game, too. You know, this is like in the 1850s, right, after the gold rush. So this is not like 500 years ago or something. They were giving people $5 a head or $5 a scalp. And a day's wages was about 25 cents. So think of how much $5 was. To murder somebody and bring back their head, they'd pay more for a female because that has the babies. The federal government ended up paying out what the new state government of California had to pay, over $1 million. That means 200 to 300,000 Indians were murdered for cash in one state. And And then also you add the pathogens that were introduced, and smallpox especially was still a killer in the 1850s. So that there's no justifying that kind of genocide, but you can't blame that on a race, because that's not like some natural teleology of whiteness to go out and colonize and have slaves and kill Indians. Like, that was a particular culture of a particular time period, has nothing to do with their genetics. And you also have to see all the white people that lived in that state that never murdered an Indian, that never had a slave, that never, all the shit they get accused of. It's like what our government does now. The bulk of Americans did not want to invade Iraq, did not blow up Fallujah or, you know, involved in Benghazi. They didn't have anything to do with it, but they have no control over it.
No,
the government just goes and does what it does, right?
Yeah, and the population's constantly lied to by its own politicians, and they're manipulated.
But they
into
always,
doing
the leftists, the identitarians on both sides, they like to blame and give credit to race rather than to, you know, markets and governments and things that actually cause these things to happen. If one area of the world has lots of, you know, a few decades of, let's say, scientific advancement or whatever, that you can't just say, well, they all are this color, so that must be the reason. You know, there's so many other factors than that's conducive to success, mainly having free markets. Sea trade would have been the early, the biggest factor in the past. And even now, that's very important. That's why you have port city countries. That's what Bahrain is. That's what Qatar is. That's what the UAE is. That's, you know, so they're fighting about in Ukraine right now.
Right. Well, I mean, I do understand that there's this this frustration, and I would not call myself a libertarian, but I do come from that milieu. I'm sympathetic towards it. I'm wondering though, the weakness of libertarianism, I think a lot of times is that people don't hear a solution being proposed to it. And I understand the argument. It's like, you don't have to propose a solution to condemn something, right? You don't have to say, well, this is wrong. You don't have to have a solution in order to say that. But, a lot of people get frustrated with libertarianism because it's like, well, what do you want us to do? We've had governments this whole time.
Sound money and free markets. This is not anarchy. You ask people, who was the best American president? Like, what would you say one of the best American presidents ever? A lot of them go way back to Jefferson or something when we were libertarian. Like, the smaller the government and the more freedom we had, those are the ones they like. Like, so you are a libertarian, or you are a Jeffersonian Republican, which is a libertarian. And so it's like, why not aim toward those principles? You don't have to have like Ron Paul as president to move that direction.
Right.
Somewhat Trump is a little bit started to lean that way on certain things, but he's far from being libertarian. But it's better than what we had before. And so you just have to move the needle.
Well,
it's kind of live action role play to be like, well, why don't we just run a bunch of libertarian candidates and win all the government? That's not going to happen for a very long time. But what you can do is force the parties that are in there now to move that direction. That's about all you can do.
Well, here's the problem, though, is that they have been importing people into our countries who are not they don't start out as libertarians, and I don't think they're going to get there. And
they import people into the country who are identitarians, who identify as a ethnic group or a religious group or some racial group.
That's true.
And identitarians are cancer.
Well, okay.
Like, it's never worked anywhere. Like, they see civic nationalism. People confuse civic nationalism with multiculturalism. Having a bunch of different ethnicities and stuff doesn't matter if you have a macro culture, like if they identify as Americans rather than as Black Americans, gay Americans, hyphenated something, where they don't hold the same values. I mean, there's a subculture in the United States that refuses to use proper grammar, like as if that's some sort of whitewashing or something. Like, there's nothing white about using proper grammar. Proper grammar is proper grammar, and to reject that, no, it's not conducive to success.
I mean,
and yet all these subcultures are promoted by this filth on Zog Media that says, oh, this is how you're supposed to act. And then they attach it to their ethnic identity and have them struggle with it. Like, if they're not acting that way, they feel like I'm not really Black or I'm not really Hispanic, because that's not how we're portrayed in Hollywood.
Sure. Okay, well, I'll explain what I mean and why I talk about race and everything. I don't think I would call myself a white nationalist. I think a better term is like a white sovereigntist, because I don't think of white people as a nation. As you mentioned, there's lots of different white nations and so on, ethnicities. So I
have to include the Italians, and who wants to do that?
Right. So I'm not like I'm not like a Richard Spencer type who wants to form a pan-European empire or anything.
He supports globalist government for whites at least, and that ain't gonna work because the French have very different ideas from the Germans, who have different ideas from the Greeks, and so on. You can't just force that kind of glove on people.
Right.
He's also a Zionist.
We just need to take over the EU for ourselves, and that'll solve everything. But
get rid of the EU.
Exactly. I agree. I'm with you on that page. I like decentralization more, at least to a point, right? But I think why I say I'm a white sovereigntist, I want white people to be able to control their own governments. And as you know from sort of the Zionists who have permeated into our system and so on, and the lobbying that goes on, that clearly isn't the case right now. And I do think there's an ethnic divide, and I think that so that's why I'm advocating for it. And also I kind of view it's not just like a my team better. I view white people sort of as a resource, and that's partly to do with IQ. That's partly to do with throughout history we've been one of the biggest innovators and
In recent history, sure.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
So I would just chalk that up to having freedom in the market rather than race, because for a long time, like Northern Europe, by the time the pyramids were built, they were still chasing pigs with spears. And you really have early civilization just hug the Mediterranean coast. You have on the I guess the Caucasian side would be Greece and Italy would be, or Rome at least, the powerhouses. But prior to that, the Egyptians, certainly, all of the Levant, the Hittites, the Turks, the Persians, and everybody had their empires, and they all hugged the Mediterranean. But south of that, south of Egypt, you don't have much going on, and north of Rome, you don't have much going on. It's not the genetics; it's the geography.
well, I've heard people say that Persians are kind of white or something, and that
Well, they like to
people in
say
the-
anybody successful is part white or whatever, but
Okay.
they certainly were not. And even Western Europe does far better than Eastern Europe. One's on the coast, the other isn't, and that's how that is everywhere in the world. The coastal area dominates over the inland area. It's like that in Australia now. It's like that in the United States now. Like Kansas will never catch up to California. It doesn't matter how white it is.
In terms of what, though? In terms of just developing.
In terms of economy, in
commerce?
terms
Yeah.
of pick a measuring stick, it won't catch up on anything.
Okay. Well, what about like
Like what we're using before about innovation and things
Innovations
like
and
that. It's
discoveries?
going to come from the coast. Yeah, because you're not only trading material wealth, you're trading ideas as well. And it's these port cities. That's when you look at where in Greece and where in Rome and where in Egypt, it's always the coastline. You can do rivers as well. And as this gap becomes less important once you have railroads and pipes and so on, but still we fight over pipelines today.
Well, what about
it's
the west coast of Africa or something like that? I mean, are they more developed?
They're more developed than the interior of Africa.
Okay.
But there's nothing west of the west coast of Africa to trade with. So northern Africa, I mean, if it's just an island by itself, far enough from stuff, that doesn't really help you. I mean, there had to be some mainland to trade with. But because you come up with certain ideas, the other side's coming up with different ideas, you swap, and now you have both sets, and you didn't have to spend the time to come up with all of it. Like, we get our writing and things from Phoenicians. That's another group that was also in Africa. Carthage is in Africa. It's in Tunisia now. As another empire, and they're a sea empire. They end up going everywhere. And the Egyptians, they went all the way up to through to Lebanon at their peak. But you have you've got river empires. Babylon certainly, like if you can be the nexus. The Hittites are surrounded by rivers and so on. The Matean and so on. But it isn't just about resources and stuff. Like Japan has a lot of coastline, but they were far enough away, and it's rough enough seas as well that it goes the other direction. It's Eastern China that dominates, and later, of course, with communism, they fall apart, and then Japan is now the second richest nation in the world, and or they might be third again, but it's up there. They had, by in the 80s, they were certainly per capita the wealthiest people, bar none, and it's about markets, and it wasn't like that before. And it wasn't peaceful before. All these Japanese, even though they had an ethno-state, you had samurai killing samurai and murdering each other. It's the narcissism of small differences. The UK did the same thing. You had all these different groups in Britain killing each other, with the Northumbrians and the Saxons and all. It does, even though they look alike, because their unity is not around biology. Unity is around ideology, and that's where nationalism and your sense of an ideological, philosophical foundation. And it can't just be like, well, they look like me, so that's enough, because that doesn't work anywhere.
Oh,
Tribe goes
it does.
in-
It does work. It works
hasn't.
with your family. I mean,
Yeah, your family.
That's why
your family
you care
is
about your
grow up
kids.
in the same house, but even then, a lot of them. I think the divorce rate's about 50%, and there's a lot of domestic abuse and stuff. So it should work on the family. But I think the family dynamic. I mean, the nuclear family itself is a cultural value. It comes from your culture and your state and your tribe.
Absolutely.
And they're trying to break that down. And you see that, and welfare really did a number in the United States. You can look at blacks, for example, were doing better in the past than the present. And with the introduction of welfare, you have the breakup of all families, but black families in particular, because as you know, welfare is not evenly distributed. If you know, depending on your victim card, you can get more money. And you know, if you can be a baby mama, you're kicking dad out of the house. And kicking dad out of the house statistically is a larger indicator than anything else for degenerate behavior and usually jail time or death for the offspring.
Well, so
but when they were together, they didn't behave that way.
So let's go with welfare, right? I don't see a way to get rid of welfare if we are going to keep on the globalist path that we're going. And so, you know, I think we would both agree that there has to be some kind of halt to immigration or rethinking of immigration, right, in these Western countries.
Well, we do need immigrants, but we don't need the third world. We only want the good ones, right? And then it's like, well, you can't just have like a test or something and be like, oh, you can come in, you can't, like that. You can do. Other places do it, but
what do you mean by the good
is,
ones? Like the ones who are smart?
People are going to, people are going to advance and further your society. I don't think a lot of people complain about Japanese neurosurgeons or Scandinavians coming in and engineers or whatever. No one cared. The problem is south of the border, right?
Oh,
like
I know people who care.
Right?
I know people who care because I've heard about immigrant like I guess because of the standards are worse in some parts of the world. The engineers come in here and they start building bridges and they fall down. So I think that people would care about.
Well, I think if that's the case, if you have engineers that build things fall down, you wouldn't hire them, regardless of where they're from.
Sure.
And I think you're kind of seeing that the I don't know what they call it, the erosion of college in general. It seems like anybody that stays long enough nowadays can get a piece of paper, and they come out not knowing anything about anything. And it's very worrisome, and that's why people want work experience, because this I graduated from blank doesn't work anymore. The credibility's gone.
Oh yeah,
and a lot of this has to do with diversity hiring and so on. And I'm totally opposed to that. Like, yeah. I'm a merit-based person. Like, you should not qualify or disqualify someone just on the basis of ethnicity. But what we have in the United States is a problem where people are getting advantages and lower standards just based on their biological group, which hurts that biological group, because the portion that would get that job or would be able to do this task anyway have their credibility undermined, because you have a swath of them that are just there because they were the right sex, color, or whatever. And so people are like, well, you're the best, or you're the best in your category. And it's got to piss off the ones that are in the least favored categories, which would be Asians and whites, who, have to try harder, have to score higher on tests, have to do everything more to get into the same type of colleges, sometimes like same jobs, especially government jobs. They'll just be like, oh, we don't have enough portion of fill in the blank, and they'll just go hire people who are not qualified. Mm-hmm. That happened recently with one of these cops at a school shooting. The police chief admitted it was a diversity hire, and this woman had no business being there. And yeah, she just sat there and hid while a rampant Jewish shooter went into a high school and murdered a bunch of people.
Oh yeah, I can think of lots of examples like that diversity hire in the I think it was Minnesota or something, where they've got a bunch of Somalians and it ended up shooting this woman.
But ultimately, I blame, again, it's kind of a broker. I blame the government for that. I don't blame the ethnic group. I blame who's doing that.
I don't blame them either. Like, I don't blame them.
The immigrants in the state.
Yeah,
it's the state that's to blame, and all our anger and focus should be toward our government, because that's who's letting the migrants in. That's who has the ability to police them and refuses to. And yeah, they get bribed by corporations. There are certain large corporations that want to use this sort of exploitable labor force because it's cheaper. But then you think, well, why is it so much cheaper? How come that guy will work for, say, $5 an hour, and another person, they need $9 or whatever it is now? Well, if you're not paying a payroll tax and all this bullshit that's attached to employment, you don't have to pay for their health care and so on, then it's significantly cheaper, and it's cheaper for the worker too, because if they don't declare that they have a job and maybe they're married or whatever and their spouse collects welfare and they're working under the table and they're not paying taxes, et cetera, then it's worth it for them too. So if you lowered the tax burden, then employment would be cheaper.
Okay, so another thing, I think maybe a flaw in what you're saying here has to do with birth rates. Now, for whatever reason, when we get these developed countries, we do see that birth rates decline. And I would agree, it's not just the white birth rate that's declining, although that's the one people are most shocked about. But anytime that we see this developing, we see the dropping in birth rates, and so that kind of perpetuates this thing. If you admit, like you did, that we need immigrants, then what's going to happen? We're going to get the smartest people. They're going to come here, be indoctrinated in our universities, and they're not going to have kids, and that's a problem globally.
The United States is still got lots of room to grow, but. A lot of states, the birth rate started dropping in the first world with the advent of the birth control pill. And this isn't a bad thing. Part of the reason the first world is the first world and it's not a third world cesspool is because of the lower birth rate. I mean, if you think about this, not only the Social Security Ponzi scheme, which would fall apart because you have a perpetually growing aging population that must constantly be replaced with larger pools of grandkids, you're just kicking the can down the road. That bubble's going to pop eventually. But there's a finite amount of property. And the more people you have, you don't increase property, right? The land is the land. Unless we can start living in the water or something, there's a fixed amount of dirt. And the more people you have, and the ratio gets bigger and bigger with lots of population, yet still the same amount of land, the more expensive the land becomes, the more expensive housing becomes. And you get the younger generation, guys your age and younger, are getting priced out of the market. Like my grandparents, whoever, could buy a huge farm or something for far less amount of labor. You don't have to measure it in their dollars and our dollars, whatever. It's like, how many hours did you have to work doing what X to get this chunk of property? Far less than now. Why? Because there's more people and they need more houses, etc. And so when you have overpopulated populaces, you end up with the favelas and things like that because there isn't enough to go around and it's too expensive. And you have to get higher and higher skill sets just to get what used to be like a median quality of life. You have to, now college isn't enough. You got to go to grad school. You got to you got to compete more and more and more just to get a house, a car, and the kind of standard that they were used to. That's one problem with it. Perpetual growth is the same ideology as a cancer cell. It's okay to replace yourself, but if you're going to collect Social Security, how are you going to pay for that? You can't just keep having more babies for infinity, and you're going to run out of property. So it's actually good to curb your population.
Ryan,
the problem is the third world isn't obeying. Right?
I think you've got a new tagline: "Drop birth control pills, not bombs."
I think introducing contraception would do one. It frees up 50% of the population, because a lot of the reason, you can say men have done more than women, and obviously they have, but definitely that gap decreased a lot after they were stopped having perpetual motherhood. And you need families and you need kids, but there is a line, of too few or too many. There's a golden mean, like Aristotle would say. Japan has figured a way out of this. This is hilarious what Shinzo Abe did, and callous, but
you got
not
foreign
as callous
workers,
as
right?
Well, it's sort of like they have foreign workers, but they can't stay here. It's allotment of 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 if you're highly skilled or something, and then you got to get out. But the thing is, that whole time they're there, they're paying into the tax system, and they don't get it back. But for the foreign worker, that's all right, because the yen is, and the standard of living is so much higher in Japan than it is in Vietnam or Malaysia or even China, that just getting what you get and leaving, you have lots of money anyway, because when you go home, it carries further. And for the Japanese, it's like people paying into the tax system who we don't have to pay for later when they're older. We don't need to pay pension funds and stuff. It's a win-win situation.
And they're not able to vote is the other thing, right?
Oh, of course not.
Yeah. It's like they don't just give them amnesty as soon as they set foot and have a child.
It's like, you're here to work, so you'll have an income. You get to live in Japan, which is not so bad. I mean, it's longest life expectancy, great education, great healthcare, like great all the measuring sticks. You got good stuff. It's not without problems or anything, but it's usually better than where they're from. And so it's a good deal for both sides. It's a win-win. And somebody like, oh, you're using them. I'm like, they're using you too. Mm-hmm. Like, they want that income. They want that high salary. They don't mind working hard. Japan has a very hard work ethic. Germany, Japan, places like this have very stringent work ethics. Right. And but that's all right. And if you don't work hard, you'll get fired. And guess what happens if you get fired? Sayonara.
And this is a perfect demonstration of why prevention is always better than cure. Because imagine if you had like half of your population already Chinese citizens, like what would the Japanese do? It would be very messy, right? And that's
we saw what they did. But it's very messy. You can't do that. And it's, if you're Chinese and you live in here for 20 years or whatever, and you speak Japanese and you follow Japanese culture, you're essentially Japanese. No one really seems to care. But when you're an identitarian and you're going to maintain your Chineseness the entire time and start writing things in Chinese and speaking Chinese and setting up a Chinatown, like what happens, that wasn't their fault in the United States. I mean, they got brought over as slaves, basically. But
also, the Chinese are very good at adapting, so they're not a good example. But
well, Chinese people do well everywhere other than China. Yeah. The Irish are kind of the same way. They do great in Boston. They do great in anywhere but Ireland, right? It's like, which just shows you that the economic and policies and opportunities, not their genes, are what were holding them back.
The problem in North America is that the Chinese are so good at assimilating that they start adopting they assimilate to the bad, SJW politics and stuff.
Well, SJWs is cancer with AIDS already. I mean, it doesn't matter who's doing it. It's terrible. Identitarianism is the route to balkanization. Like, you cannot have a bunch of competing cultures and ideas. You can have lots of subcultures and things because they're just tertiary stuff like, music and food and dress and what, because that doesn't really matter. We're talking about core values, about economics, things like that. And if you're not supporting free markets, if you're a fucking communist or a socialist, these are not just like, whimsical political ideas without consequences. This will destroy your society.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like, a lot of these conservatives who rail against identity politics, they turn around and then they're like pandering to blacks. They're like, here's our black, Turning Point USA.
Black community.
This is our black event.
Blah, 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 right? The black church, the black this, the black that.
Because they're so desperate to get them in there. And it's like,
and
they don't deal with
you know what? Blacks are at fault as well for gobbling up this garbage. Not all of them. I mean, they're conservative blacks, but I think it's been changing. It used to be like 95, and now I think it's only like 90% vote Democrat. But people, if someone's out there promising to give you money just based on your color, and it's like, I'm going to vote myself free stuff, and groups will do that. Every group does that. But we shouldn't have identitarian politics. There shouldn't be favoritism based on category. You have rights. You don't have black rights or gay rights, or rights are rights. And equal opportunity for all does not mean equal outcome. Doesn't mean, equal outcomes one of the dumbest things I've ever heard of. Like, you can't let's make more male nurses and more female engineers. Why? If that changes, it changes, but it does it on its own, because those are all personal decisions. There may be cultural or biological pressure why somebody does this or that, but you cannot force things to look like, it's got to be exactly proportional to the demographics of the area. The odds of that happening, of every occupation being exactly X% Y or whatever across all fields, is essentially zero.
Well, I think this is why a lot of people who are now, they call themselves alt-right, would say, like, we've realized that this multiculturalism isn't working because people aren't getting this message. I mean, a good percentage of white people have taken the message, but a lot of these other groups haven't. And so, you know, it's like, I'm a white person, like, I understand, maybe I agree with you that, like, we shouldn't have identity politics, but that's why you don't let these other groups into the country to begin with. Like, I think to some degree, if you can preserve your ethnic homogeneity, then you can have fair rights for everyone within the country. And so a lot of whites are just kind of fed up with it.
It usually starts breaking down with class, like when the U.S. was, you know, almost entirely white, not including the sections controlled by the natives. It was, you know, wealthy male property owners. Like, females were not included. If you didn't own land, you weren't included.
Sure.
It wasn't by race, and they certainly did have a racial identity. They thought, you know, we're civilizing the savages and blah blah blah. They had a Christian identity as well. And then, you know, that starts breaking down because you get different sects of Christianity, and then they start fighting with each other. Again, it's the narcissism of small differences. Like, whenever it's been tried to, like, unify around something arbitrary, like biology or something, they just split and fight with each other anyway.
Wait.
So having an actual philosophy is much stronger than just an identity of we look alike or whatever.
So
language is another unifier too. I mean, lots of different white people speak different languages, and you just can't rule over a group that doesn't.
I'm not sure why biology is arbitrary, but merit is not arbitrary.
No, merit isn't. And if it ends up being 85% white, then so be it. But you don't exclude people based on ethnic identity or whatever. You know, and then with that IQ thing, something interesting about that tends to be more regional than it does racial. Pretty much all the northern groups, people probably, and this is just my speculation, that, you know, winter forced people to have foresight, you know, over enough time. The you know, East Asians, the Northern Europeans, and Northern Native Americans all have that big brain, large IQ across the globe. And around the equator, not so much. But it isn't like just whites. Actually, the whites and Indians were about the same, and I think Asians are slightly higher. And that'll change sometimes.
But Ryan,
not too much.
Ryan, how do you respond to what's known as the brain drain, where we get all of the smart people, and then other countries just fall apart because they don't have any smart people of their own?
Well, the reason people migrate to another area is better economic opportunity. That's why your economic philosophy better be better than your neighbors, because people will flee and go, hey, if I stay in India, nothing's going to happen. If I go to New York with the same skill set I have, you know, I can make a lot of money and be better for my family, or whatever, you know, whatever country, whatever example. And so there's going to be a brain drain. But that's why India ought to change and say, you know, maybe we ought to model, you know, change our model to be more like the United States, or more like Japan, or more like whatever you see working. Maybe North Korea wants to be like South Korea. You've got the same race, you got the same language, but one's starving to death and the other's doing pretty good.
Well, but here we circle back to the original point, which is governments. Like, frankly, right. I don't think the government's going to do that, because the government isn't in the business of competition. They're in the business of ruling over their people.
Well, yeah, they just break the law. I mean, constantly North Koreans are escaping, and that's refugees. Those are real refugees. They're not just there for social welfare. They are leaving because they are actually dying. And they go to China, and they go to South Korea eventually through China. And it is bleeding, and look, they're making steps to change, because an empire of what? Peasants, you know, he sees the writing on the wall, and it will break just the way East Germany broke. Like, but war is not the way. It's quick, but that is not an answer. It just causes more problems down the line and a lot of death anyway. So, but, you know, economic pressures would say, maybe, you know, we should have negotiated NAFTA a long time ago. Trump's doing it finally. But, you know, when you've got a nation run by drug cartels, which is supported by the CIA, they don't care. They don't have any national interest. They only care about themselves. They only care about themselves and their family, right? Well, that doesn't work well for a nation state. That's why, as a nationalist, you got to care about your nation, your culture. Sometimes that'll overlap with ethnicity and sometimes it won't. In the New World, it doesn't so much. Like Latin America there is no dominant anything. There's, people will say Latin, but that's everything. That's Italian, German, Amerindian, Black. It's, but you can have Brazilian or Colombian, or you can have a nationalist identity and a common language. But the drugs, the drugs have done a number on that area.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm a bit utopian, but I want there to be sovereignty for everybody. I think maybe I think we could have a lot of what you're talking about if we finally if everyone in the world, or it doesn't have to be everyone in the world, but a large part of the world was on board with this guaranteed right to sovereignty. And the founding fathers, they had some idea of this when they made the different states, and they said what state can secede and everything. But
I'm glad you admit that.
Yeah. Yeah. Theoretically,
you think there might be secession in the future? Like, could we just sell Portland? Can we just give it to Tel Aviv?
Yeah.
I mean,
and I mean, frankly, it would solve. Like, I think it would make everyone happy, because then the white nationalists, they could go and form their ethno state if they want, right?
Well, I mean, you can have an ethnic housing division or something already. I don't know if you can find anything on the scale of a state. There just aren't that many white nationalists.
But hang on, like, you're a libertarian, so if some other group of people wants to form a country that is based on race, you wouldn't like it, but you would say,
no,
okay,
you can form a community based on race, but I don't want the government making people or making people not have to live together or not be allowed to live together. I think that's up to the people. So if you want to build a community and it's all Koreans or all whites or whatever in the United States, have at thee. But I don't want the state to enforce it. Like, there's a Koreatown in LA where most of the people there are bilingual and speak Korean and whatever, right? And it just sort of meshes as part of Los Angeles, right? It's not causing problems or anything. It is all Korean, but they're not like at war with the neighboring whoever's. And that's just all right. That's what you want to do. And there's also Koreans that don't live in Koreatown. They just live wherever in Los Angeles. And that's fine. It's not like you're not allowed to live in Koreatown either. If you're not Korean, you could move there if you're white or something. So that's the thing, is like, it may end up like this where you have communities, but I don't want the government deciding, because everything our government does turns to shit.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Like, if you're talking about a secession, then it is a separation from the government, and so the whites in that the whites in that community would, they'd have sovereignty. They'd be able to form their own government. I mean, isn't that within the bounds of freedom of association? I mean, why should those people have to be subject to, welfare or income tax and all this stuff from the federal government?
I'm all for having a Confederate states. Like, I'm all for it. It doesn't have to break down how it did before, but I don't like the federal government. I don't see them really doing anything but taxing you and going to war on behalf of Israel. Mm-hmm. We don't need that. We don't need the trillions of dollars that our debt beholden federal government does with its partnership with the Fed. They're not helping you. They're not serving you. And like, the things like, oh, we're going to renegotiate this trade or that. Why don't you just allow business to business trade? Why is the government involved? They just get out. We have interstate commerce. Nobody's setting tariffs between Virginia and North Carolina or something, right? That's real free trade. I can go to any state and sell whatever, right? The exception of tobacco and firearms, which I don't agree with. I think they should get rid of all that too. Like, just have free trade. So yeah, I'm all for having Confederate states. Because I think it's ridiculous to assume that 300 million people have a common culture. I don't think they do. I think the United States clearly, and you can look at voting records back all the way prior to the Civil War even, there are clearly at least three cultural groups there. With you have the South, which would now include Kentucky and West Virginia and some of northern states from Civil War times. But culturally, there's a southern area, there's a Northeast, and then you have those weirdos in California. And then I would also say that Alaska and Hawaii have their own separate, culture. So there's nothing wrong, and we'd still all be a country, but confederation might be better rather than having one size fits all. The federal government just comes down and says, whatever, gay marriage is the thing, or abortion is the thing, or this is the thing, or that. Let it be state by state.
Yeah.
Because you're alienating about half the people, no matter who wins.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unfortunate that history has shown, at least recent history, that it seems to always be going in the one direction and not going towards centralization and not away from centralization. I'd like to think that is possible. Maybe it is, but it's an idea, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's okay to go. It's not like one direction's bad, the other's good. Sometimes centralization's better if you do have a common culture, like Crimea, where people speak Russian, traditionally part of Russia until 1954, and they rejoined Russia again because their language got outlawed in Ukraine, and there's regional scapegoating. Then they can break away, but they can break away and rejoin another group. They don't have to just be the independent state of Crimea or something. Texas joining the United States is another example where joining's okay too, if that's more in common with your culture than where you're currently trapped or something. But in all those both examples, that's you also have to have secession. Crimea had to secede from Ukraine before it could join Russia, and Texas had to secede from and have two wars with Mexico before, which also seceded from Spain itself before it could join the United States. So secession is part of the world, and I think with the United States would be happier under a confederacy where you didn't have looming federal mandates that force laws on everyone. Like you've seen, there are referendums, but they're not available in every state. And this is not a big issue to me, but it is to a lot of people, was legalization of marijuana. Mm-hmm. I think over 20 states have legalized it now.
I saw you posted that
article. Want to, right?
I saw you posted that article about how it lowers IQ, right?
If you smoke pot when you're a child, it will permanently lower your IQ.
Okay. They
did a 30-year study on that. Well, I think if you drank alcohol as a child, it would fuck up your brain too, probably. Yeah. But anyway, I posted that because I had some Brit, and it's always some inbred Brit, that gave me a new conspiracy theory, because people know I work on 9/11 and stuff, so they think I believe every conspiracy ever for some reason. And they said it's something called the mud floods, and this is so bad. I don't even want to give it. It's just they couldn't figure out that, oh my gosh, you look at old buildings and sometimes there's like a basement on one side and not the other because they're built on a hill. And like the old State House in Boston, for example. And they'll go like, oh, that's because there was like some giant cataclysmic event and it filled everything up with mud and the earth. I'm like, no, dude, how about people dug a hole? And I just thought, how can you be an adult and be this fucking stupid? And I asked him, when did you start smoking pot? He's like, oh, I haven't touched it since I was a kid. I go, okay. So I thought, like, how much were you smoking as a child? Because it doesn't, if you smoke enough, any drug as a child while your brain's developing, it's permanent damage. And I've seen that over and over again. All these flat earthers and stuff like that are potheads. And I'm not saying pot makes you stupid, because a lot of them were probably dumb anyway, and then also added pot to it. But if you are young, a teenager, you should not be doing drugs. It will fuck up your brain. And I'm not one of these people that are like, just say, like, I'm for legalization, prostitution, drugs, everything, but not for children, because it is a actual health. This is not like, oh, don't do drugs. You might like eat too many brownies and laugh at SpongeBob. I don't see the harm in it, because it doesn't really matter for adults. Like, we're not all going to be rocket scientists or whatever. And I think there's certain jobs that I call weed jobs. If you're doing some factory mundane crap, one way to get through the day might be to just get high. You can still do it all, but I don't know.
Anyway, speaking of toxicity, you had mentioned in that one tweet that got a bunch of people, including myself, kind of stir crazy or whatever. But you mentioned that it was like, I don't know if you said white nationalism or the alt-right was toxic, and to some degree, maybe I agree. Okay. So I want to know. I want to know how you define toxic, because some people could say you're toxic. Right. I mean, you've been banned from I think Patreon. Is that the only place you've been banned?
I wasn't banned on Patreon. I was banned from Vimeo for
Vimeo?
criticizing.
Okay, but yeah,
getting deplatformed is anybody that speaks out against Jewish power is going to get deplatformed. But that doesn't mean you all have some kind of common ground there. What I mean by toxic is, like, I'm allowed to work. I'm allowed to, no one's after me. Like, okay, in this very specific industry of challenging Zog media, they go after everybody. But people that follow and hug on Spencer's nuts and stuff, like, I'll be in a chat on Heel Turn or something, and there's like 6 or 7 guys, all with like little cartoon avatars and fake names. Why? Because if you have your real name and face, what would happen? You would immediately get fired. And that's what I mean by toxic. Like, you think this is a winning strategy when you're a bunch of grown-ass guys that have like frog pictures and stuff, because you cannot say your real name because you'll get disowned, fired, no career, no money, and you end up homeless or whatever. And you want to run candidates on a white nationalist platform. You think that's not LARPing when you can't even say your name, right? That is not a winning strategy. I laid out, before all this shit went down, how to stop illegal immigration. And I had a 4-part plan of like what's contributing to it. The social welfare system, the foreign escapades overseas, especially in the case like invading Libya, etc. And the trade agreements like NAFTA that decimate third world economies, predatory lending, da-da-da. And I went specifically, point by point, what to do about each one of those things. But what I didn't do is say, well, we're going to solve our demographic problem, have more white babies, and kick out 40% of the country. That's not going to happen. That's why I said it's LARPing. It's live action role playing. You can't even show your face to say your name, and you think this is a winning strategy. It's toxic. When Spencer went to Charlottesville, what happened? They put a tarp over General Lee. The park was renamed. A bunch of people went to jail. One guy committed suicide just because he was there, and he got associated to Nazis. He went home. He lost his job. His school rejected him. I think he got kicked out of grad school, whatever. All because he was wearing a T-shirt at the event and got identified, and he wasn't there for any sort of white power bullshit. He was actually there as a Southerner on behalf of General Lee and wanting to protect his statues. Didn't matter. His life was ruined because it's toxic. If you're going to go around with tiki torches, now if you're living off your daddy's money because you're a trust fund money and you don't have any skin in the game, you're just a little baby that lives off his parents, like Spencer, then yeah, you can show your face and you can say all the most pro-Hitler shit you want or whatever. It doesn't matter. You can do that because you don't need a job, right? You don't have any skin in the game. You don't have to care about illegal immigrants because you don't need to care about jobs. You're a trust fund baby. But all these other people, there are people in Charlottesville right now sitting in prison.
Yes.
And look, what happened the following year when Spencer wasn't there? Last August, Antifa showed up. There's no Nazis to chase, so the media could. The only way to make a bunch of armed communists look good is to have goose-stepping, tiki torch, Klan hood, swastikas, all that shit. That was the narrative they need. That's why you always see the rabbi spray painting a swastika, usually backwards. And what you doing, rabbi? They need Nazis to the point too, because that justifies their behavior. It's the only thing that helps them get away with it. The following year, Antifa came. There's no right wing to throw shit at. They got beat up by the police and arrested. And that's what would have happened the first time. If it had just been us out there advocating for Lee, there wouldn't have been a problem. But instead, they hijacked an event about a Civil War memorial and monument and made it about themselves. And all the results were terrible.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's entirely true. Like, originally they were trying to bring everyone together, and that didn't happen, I think, because of certain individuals they didn't want to associate with the far right, you know? And so that really kind of doomed everything, because
every channel, dude, every channel was talking about Spencer and the stupid tiki tortures and chanting blood and soil. That's what it was. It became, even though Trump's the only person that had a nuanced say on this, by the way, there are a large chunk of people have been there for months going to the park, to Lee Park, which is now what do they call it, Emancipation Park, whatever, about the statue issue. I lived in Charlottesville. When I graduated high school, I was working on protecting Civil War monuments in Virginia and won. But fast forward, that was back in 97, 98. Fast forward to now, to 2016 or 17, whenever that shit was. And they're taking statues down ever since Dylan Roof, right? The South Carolina shooter, because he had a Confederate flag on a shirt on Facebook. So therefore, he's a representative of the South all of a sudden. There wouldn't be Charlottesville without General Lee, by the way. The Yankees would have burned it down like they burned down a lot of other cities. But anyway, this is someone that protected his state and his people, and they want to take down his monument. And they put a big tarp on it, and they would have taken it down, but it was going to cost $300,000 to move it. That's the only reason they didn't move it. They didn't have the money. But what got them to win, in Virginia of all places, and Robert E. Lee, not like some obscure Civil War general. This is the man. This is, if you can do that to Lee in Virginia, you can do it to anybody anywhere. Was a bunch of like neo-Nazis coming down and representing the quote unquote the other side, which just created, we all the time are fighting the stigma of the South being labeled as racist and a bunch of cousin fucking retards or whatever. And here comes a bunch of meth heads from Ohio and a bunch
now,
of
I think I think you might be characterizing it based on what the media wants you to characterize it on. I mean, they focused on the one guy who had this swastika flag, right? And it had these folded creases in it, like he had just bought it, right? A little suspicious.
There were only like 4 Klansmen and like a little group of Nazis.
Yeah.
But somebody went around handing tiki torches to people and chanting Nazi slogans, and that was Richard Spencer. And the media spent all day focused on him because he's a pariah, and that's why I say he's toxic. Like, if he had just stayed home, none of this shit would have happened.
I'm not entirely sure about
because
that.
he didn't. I am, because they didn't show up the following year, and nothing happened. Antifa got arrested, and there was no media about Nazis. Like, it has made the city of Charlottesville look like some sort of racist cesspool, and it's not.
Well, I don't know about that. I think they're pretty anti-white
I lived
racists.
there. I went to high school there. It is not like that. Those people on both sides, from Antifa and all the other white nationalist groups, were bussed in there and drove there. Nobody was there from Charlottesville except for the people there protecting the statue.
Right.
And they didn't even talk about the statue the whole time.
I mean,
not one speech was given about Robert E. Lee.
It is kind of a tragic thing, because I do believe that this was a setup. Like,
it's almost like somebody was a Fed or something. That's what it seems like.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know. Consequences except for one guy, and everybody around him's going to prison and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we can speculate, but for whatever reason, the government there, they didn't even wait till they started speaking to shut it down. It was shut down.
The cops were on the side of the communists.
Yes.
And the cops were on the side of the communists because the other side had a couple token Nazis. And it's just like, dope, you can't defend Nazis. It's just like, in our culture, that is fair or not, because I have different opinions about World War II than most people. But that is how it is. And you got to recognize that. Like, I'm a pragmatist. You can't be like, well, it ought to be like, well, no. It is like this. And that is toxic. And that is a losing strategy. If you want to oppose illegal immigration, if you want to oppose welfare, if you want to actually win that fight, then you cannot come at it as a white nationalist neo-Nazi, because that's exactly how you're going to lose the quickest. In Europe, too, like, what's the weapon the left uses whenever somebody opposes illegal immigrants? What do they say? You're a Nazi, xenophobic, racist, bigot, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And when you actually are those things, you're like, yeah, I am, and you own it. It's like you've just alienated the other 90% of the population that does not agree with that at all. even though they want to curb immigration, they are not doing it on a racial basis. And these people have to realize that they are toxic and they are a super minority.
Oh yeah, I mean we do have to realize the propaganda. It's still, 80 years after this big war, it's still in people's minds, and that's because they've been drilling it in. But
you got to get my Christmas album.
What's that?
I reworded a bunch of Christmas songs with a World War II theme.
Oh, good.
You'll see it. It'll be leaked on the web soon.
That's funny.
It's really good, dude.
Yeah.
There's a commercial for it up on BitChute, but yeah, it's pretty funny.
Can you give me an example of a song title?
Well, are you putting this online? Because that'll get it ovened.
Oh, okay. It's not
spinning squirrel stuff.
It's toxic itself, right?
Right? Oh yes, it is, and that's the way to do. It's that kind of stuff. It's like if I were to openly parade around with that, I wouldn't get anywhere in politics. But at the same time, you think like I'll talk about things that if they're true, they're true. And I'm not defending Nazis or anything in it like that. Like this is nothing that should be toxic, and it's not toxic to the majority of the population either. It's just toxic online because that's run by Silicon Valley, and this particular group really hates this message. But most Americans would agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking there's actually this open Nazi Arthur Jones who because he was running unopposed, he got the Republican nomination in Illinois or something. I want to say like 30% maybe voted for him or something. It was some large number, but it's still, you're right, there isn't, it's not enough at this point.
There's a lot of people who would just vote Republican automatically without even knowing the name or anything too.
Yeah.
There's a way, but like that just wasn't the way to do it. Like I'm totally for free speech. And I've extended an olive branch out to Kevin Alfred Strong because they've been deplatformed 7 times for the payment processors. And I'm like, hey, why don't you just use mine in Asia? And like, I don't agree with what he's saying, but I feel like, but what if I'm wrong, right? That's why I want to have free speech so that other people, because I've had my mind changed before,
sure,
and just let all the ideas out and let it be. And it's really sad. And I totally disagree with white nationalists or anyone else not being allowed to speak, not being allowed to have the war of ideas, right? But I think the theatrical stunts that you do when you definitely know how they're going to react to it was just bad tactics, man. Like if you want to argue with people, great, do that until you get enough where you could go out and demonstrate or something. But if you just like Patrick Little, when you're holding a sign that says Jews rape kids or something, like all you're doing is hurting yourself. Like you're not going to cause some mass movement or anything, and you're just going to you can't even work for Uber now. You know what I mean? And I talk to him on Skype like once a week, and I'm trying to help this guy, right? And he's not racist either. He'll always be labeled as one, but he isn't. But he is definitely like has a problem with the Jews, and I'm like, well, I say it's Zionism because I think it's ideology, not biology, and people can disagree with that if they want, but I don't think you're ever going to change people's minds if you don't let them speak. And that's why in my mind, sunshine is the best policy. And I will go on and argue with like 7 white nationalists versus me, like 7 against 1, because no one else will talk to them.
And the media will
just
slam
like,
you for that.
Drop the mic, you know what I mean? Oh, they'll hate me or whatever, but
yeah.
like, hey, I'm the one talking to you.
You gave these guys a platform by debating them and trying to smash their ideas. It's like, what? What are you talking about? But
yeah, and I'm not against them. I'm not against white nationalists. I'm against white nationalism. Like I think civic nationalism is better, and I have a lot of history and stuff to back that up. And a lot of things they attribute to race is the same. It's just like the left. They're like, well, Isaac Newton was white and this guy was white and they were smart. I'm like, well, that's great. But that's market forces. I mean, you can see
Ryan,
places that don't produce anything until they change their government. It's different.
I hope you understand. You are unique, though. Like a lot of people will not even engage with those ideas. And
I know. Well, I don't see why you should be afraid of them. Like, if you have arguments against them, then let it be. But the left doesn't, because the left is racist. They're the real racists, and they always have been. because they're racist to whites, for one. Like you were saying, they'll say whites killed the Indians, whites enslaved the Africans, whites also enslaved other whites, but they blame that on biology. I'm like, that everybody had slaves. Like, there's like 4 societies, you know, like briefly the Persians got rid of slavery with Cyrus the Great. There are a few American Indian groups that didn't have slaves, and I'm sure there's some I don't know about or something, but generally everybody had slaves. Japan had slaves, China had slaves, Arabs had slaves, blacks had slaves, whites had slaves. Every group had slaves. Not every single.
The Jews had slaves. Uh-oh.
Well, yeah, that's the funny story about the Bible story, right? They are freed from Babylon, which included the Egyptians during the height of its empire. And what do the Hebrews turn around and do? They enslave the Philistines. So it's like, and they, I mean, some of the most prominent characters and Bible figures had slaves and indentured servants, both, which is a form of slavery.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, I think
the commandments mention adultery, but not owning people. And actually, the chapter after that, Exodus 21, verse 20, is like, if you beat your male or female slave with a rod and they die as a result, you should be punished. But if they get up after a day or two, you are not to be punished, for they are your property.
Right.
So it's not like they didn't know or forgot or something. They just thought it was okay. God thought slavery was okay. The Hebrew God. So yeah. Everybody had it. It wasn't like it's an economic thing. It was probably necessary in ancient times. You can make that argument, as fucking immoral as it is. Yeah. It's not like they had this idea of banks and money, and they didn't. That's hard to develop. You know.
Yeah. What I want to see what your take is on this point here that I hear often is that the radicals or the far right, whatever, they act as kind of a shield for the less extreme people. So, in other words, the censorship of conservatives would be worse than it is now if the big tech companies were not, occupied trying to set up, maybe not so much at this exact point in time, but in the past, like trying to go after white nationalists and criminalize them and something. Do you think there's any merit to that?
I think the opposite, actually. I think what they go and say to their public of like, well, either like, why not just have free speech? Or like, well, except for violence. And everybody's like, okay, yeah, we shouldn't have any violence. So like, and hate speech, right? And hate speech means anything Zionists don't like. But they'll go, oh yeah, everyone hates Nazis. So they're like, yeah, you can ban Nazis. And then that's where the slippery slope starts. Like having a revisionist on my show or something is why all this shit starts happening to me or whatever, right? And I'm going to do it anyway. But like, but I don't blame them. They are what, like, if you talk to them or whatever, that will be the death of you because they want to isolate these people. But you got to blame Silicon Valley. They're the one doing the censoring, right? Mm-hmm. Not the white nationalists.
Well, but they call Sargon of Akkad
some of the most open line. Well, I've been called a Nazi.
Exactly.
Like, I've been called a Zionist. I've been called everything. I'm like, I can't believe somebody even called me a liberal, and I was like, oh my god, I got to draw the line at that. You can call me a Zionist. You can call me a Nazi. You can call me a fucking communist. I don't know how. Don't call me a fucking liberal. Because the thing is, like, someone calling me a Nazi or a commie or something is so far, out there that very few people would believe it. But if you just look at me and be like, that guy's a liberal, I'm like, no, fuck you, dude. Like, I don't even want to have a federal government. Like, I'm hardcore libertarian.
Nobody's going to look at you and think you're a liberal. I don't think you look like it, but...
Well, yeah, I don't have purple hair and a nose ring and whatever, but a lot of white nationalists think I'm a liberal, and I'm like, dude, not being racist is not liberal. Like, most people aren't racist. And I'm not a race denier. That's the other extreme they like to go to. Like, what are you saying? It's just a social construct? Doesn't exist? Like, no, motherfucker. Race is real. Like, different diseases affect different populations differently because you're different inside and out. It isn't just your skin and all. Like, I recognize race. Mm-hmm. I'm on Team Yellow. I jumped ship. I'm on the winning team. Half the planet is Asian.
They genetically modified you already?
Well, my children are half Asian, so like I've joined the winning side.
Yeah.
I mean, Native Americans are going to be extinct, and we're all going to be extinct. Like, Asia's one. You want to talk about the baby problem? It's not Hispanics you got to worry about. half the planet is Asian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They won. Race war's over. Team yellow for the win. Get on that gold ladder. No, I'm just kidding.
Wow, that's a very dark note to.
Future. It's not through violence or anything. They're just having more kids, and they got a lot of land and a lot of room. Like China could send 26 million people over to a place, take it over, and you wouldn't even notice a difference in China. They got billions, right? Billions of them. So
yeah, they're playing the long-term game. Do you think that there's a reason though that Asia hasn't succumbed?
They do have the highest IQ, so like, should we just like give up? No,
IQ supremacy, exactly.
I think that IQ is the most mitigating factor too. I think creativity and a lot of other things.
Some people say that the Ashkenazi have a higher IQ.
No, East Asians have the highest IQ. Okay. What they do is say Ashkenazis have higher than Asian, but they're also including like India and stuff as Asia.
Oh.
But if you just take Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan like that, they're way higher.
Okay.
And I can tell you just from living here, like, we're dumb.
But what I was going for is, what do you think there's a reason that that is more than just genetic or whatever, that that East Asia is resistant to this liberalism?
Well, I mean, they're liberal in the classic sense. Like they have constitution and women's rights, and like they're liberal. So what do you mean? You mean like by like the SJW crap? They don't have Jewish media.
I think so. You think that's the reason?
That is the reason.
Yeah, I mean they're very woke on this issue. Right?
Can I tell you a funny story with a monk? I was at a train station. I was like, I have a baby, so I had a stroller, and we're just walking around for no reason. I just want him to see new stuff or to go in his brain and just see things. He's a little tiny baby. And there's this monk, and he's like, "Hey, come here," and he said it in English. And I thought, yeah, someone wants to see the Hafu baby. It's common, whatever, or any baby. Oh, cute. So I go over there thinking he wants to see my child, and he was like, maybe he just wanted to use his English too. That's my second thought. But he's like, "I seen you around here. Do you live around here?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "Oh, are you an English teacher?" I said, "No." Is he in the military? I said, "No," because that's 99% of foreigners, right? Yeah. The rest would be like, I don't know, missionaries or something. I said, "No." He's like, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a journalist." And he goes, "Ah, are you American?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Are you Jewish?" I said, "No." He goes, "Oh, because American media is run by the Jews." What?
He just assumed.
He just said, I thought they're all Jewish. I said, "Holy shit." This is a monk. Wow. And I was like, no, I'm not. But I couldn't help but smile. Like, there's no taboo here. I think another reason is, like, part of the reason the Israeli state has so much support in the United States is from Christianity, where there is a certain portion of particular type of Christians that it's complicated. They don't feel like figuring out what's going on, but it's just simply Judaism is more familiar than Islam. Because the Old Testament, part of the Bible is the Old Testament.
Well,
the first 5 books. So
it's interesting you say that, because I've seen a study that shows Jews themselves, if they're asked which do you identify with closer, Christianity or Islam, they choose Islam.
Yeah, Jews would do that, but Christians wouldn't. They don't know anything about Islam. Yep. Islam comes after, and it's competition. I mean, I think there's still more Christians, about 1 billion, 2 billion on each side or something. Judaism's never going anywhere. I mean, you're talking about millions. And so it's not a threat to being the world's most dominant religion. So some of them are on team anti-Muslim for that reason. But like, I don't really see much good in any of them. But it all depends on the individual. Like I said before, it's kind of like the horse and the rider type of thing, or a car, you could say. A horse has a brain. Religion is a little bit like a car. If you're like Ron Paul in Christian and you have good values and you're a good person, then you'll have a good religion. And if you're a bad person, you'll have a bad religion. Even the exact same religion. Because it's all up to how you decide to interpret it. and it's just there as a cloak of authority to justify behavior you want to do anyway. Because all of them are like, oh, I don't see Christians advocating the monarchy. I don't see people want to go back to animal sacrifice. I don't see the reinstitution of slavery. So they're ignoring all this large part. No one really thinks he lived in a whale's belly for 3 days. Nobody really thinks a lot of these miracles. Now they're metaphors all of a sudden, even though they were literal for 1,000 years. And they just keep reinterpreting it to make it fit what their real master is their culture. They make their religion fit their culture rather than the other way around. Our culture will not let you get rid of women's suffrage. So you're going to have to keep it, even if your religion is patriarchal.
I would modify your statement a little bit. I would say the church is like a vehicle. I think
the church is like a business.
Yeah, and you see the Pope. The Pope is a great example. He's like taking, kissing the feet of migrants and everything.
The who? I love.
Oh yes, of course. But
I never heard of the Pope. What is that?
And that's the beautiful thing about religion is you can disagree with the church. In the past you might have gotten your head chopped off, but
you can disagree with them now.
You can disagree with them,
places.
And you can say, well, I don't recognize this as the authority of Christ or of God.
Well, Protestants already don't recognize the Pope and the cardinals and the bishop. They have a direct relationship with God rather than through this chain of authority. And I'll let them argue about that. I just look at it and go, dude, the earth was not made in 6 days, and et cetera, et cetera. It's just not for me. But if someone wants to believe that, I don't care. Like, I go to a church here in Japan because it's free Japanese. But, and I already know the stories, so it's easy for me to, study. But, I have no problem with anybody.
I care a little bit because I don't want them. I think that it's unhealthy to have lots too many illusions, but at the same time, I've warmed to religion and I guess converted.
Well, I think they're in check because they're definitely the super duper minority, so they don't have any power and they can't really do anything, and so it's almost like they are the contrarians. The Christians in Japan are like the rebels or whatever, because no one here is religious. And if they are, it's usually just custom. It's not like some sort of deep. They have secular philosophy for sure. They believe in honor and all that, but it doesn't have any supernatural stories tied to it. There are people aren't you Buddhist? I'm like, no, they do funeral rites like that, and that's about it. They'll have Christian weddings, Buddhist funeral, Shinto birth, right? Just because they have better ceremonies, for each of those things. New Year's is usually Shinto as well because it's pretty cool custom. But I would liken that to having a birthday cake with candles and singing happy birthday to you. The origin of that is from the goddess Bast, which was the moon goddess, which how they measured times. Month comes from moon and so on. And they used to put a round circle cake on the temple and light it with a candle, and candles were super expensive. So as saying, I want another set of moons, meaning another year, an anniversary. And this is where Monday and Lunar and Getsuyobi and all these different languages start with the moon day and the sun day. It's a long story, but no one really digs into the history of happy birthday. They just I don't know, you get a round cake, you put candles on it, you make a wish, and you sing a song. It's not religious. It's just custom. And that's how religion in Japan is. They got a bunch of customs they do. Half of them don't even know how or what it's related to, and they don't really believe in a moon goddess or whatever. It's just fun, and that's all. But Christians in Japan are they're come from missionaries, so they're serious Christians. They're not we just go to church on Christmas and Easter. They're seriously believe this and practice and trying to figure out the Bible and how guide as their life and how they should act as a person. And I respect that more than people who are tertiary Muslim, Christian, whatever, but they drink and they eat bacon and da-da-da, well, for Islam. So I think whatever floats your boat, man. I'm a libertarian with religion too. Freedom of religion and freedom to not have a religion. Just don't knock on my door with pamphlets. Unless you want to talking to.
Very good, very good. Well, do you want to give people your info one more time so that my audience can find you?
Yeah, I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of haters, and some people might like what I have to say too. And I think we need to have more discussions about race. Nobody challenges anybody on it. Nobody offers any alternative explanations for why this area of the world or that did better in science or something, you know. So we need more discussion like that. And the thing is, you can't, because you're not allowed. Like, I'm like, why?
Yeah.
You're afraid of what the result might be? Like, hey, what if the racists are right? Well, you know what? If they're right, they're right. We should always pursue truth. I don't think they're right, but I think a lot of leftists can't make that argument. I think a lot of leftists, they're like what I call paternalistically racist. They're like, oh, the poor African children, we have to give them aid and this. I'm like, why? Why can't they grow their food? They can, but not if you're going to be giving away free stuff. How are they supposed to sell their goods if you're going to be giving things away? Like, try having a shoe store when the government comes around giving away shoes. You're not going to have that store very long. And I made a whole film about Africa. But anyway, all my films, the most popular one is mostly about September 11th and the surrounding events. It's called The Empire Unmasked.
I've seen that one. Very good.
It's better. It keeps improving because I keep like updating it. So if it's been a year or whatever since you watched it, they might want to see it again. It was showed from Vimeo, but it's on ancreport.com. There's a tab on the top that says films. So there's The Empire Unmasked. If you're poor, you can just watch War by Deception. It's sort of the watered down version, but it's free, and it lets you know the Israeli and Saudi role on 9/11. And then there's films about Syria, Palestine, Africa.
What are you working on now?
A film about Yemen and Maritime Silk Road, because Yemen, Ukraine, and Iran all linked together. And I kind of did I did an interview on Red Ice. If anybody's a Red Ice member, just look up the Ryan Dawson interview. Like the second half, we went into Yemen, and I gave the maps and all this. See, to boil it down, why is Saudi Arabia attacking Yemen? And don't say Shia Sunni, because that ain't the reason. I mean, they're not attacking Oman. They want to get a port city so that they can circumvent the Strait of Hormuz. Because in the event of a war with Iran, which is what Israel wants, the first thing Iran would do is shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And if you think the tax in France on gas is bad, just imagine what happens when that Saudi oil gets cut to a standstill. It's not going to happen. So they need a port they need coastal real estate and a pipeline so that they're able to ship their gas and oil without going through the straits so that Iran can't shut it down. They cannot make moves on Iran until they win the war in Yemen. But it looks like they're not going to win the war in Yemen. And this is all spelled out with maps and stuff on a Red Ice interview. And if you want to wait for the film, it's only going to be like $2 or something. I'm just kind of like paying for my time. But it's very important. People are like, why should I give a shit about Yemen? And like, you need to. Because a lot of people are like, why should I care about Libya? I'm like, well, ask a Somali in Sweden and you'll know. Because the cork came out of the bottle when you killed Gaddafi. And you need to care about things that you don't realize immediately are going to affect how you live, but they will. And it's just a moral thing too. If you're a good Christian or Jew or Muslim, then you shouldn't want kids to starve to death.
No, I definitely
that
don't
argument
want kids.
is something people will say, but they don't really give a fuck.
I'm just a terrible racist, right? Because I apparently I should be caring about, or I shouldn't care about brown kids dying, but I do, I guess.
Yeah,
silly me.
Kids dying are going to lead to white kids dying too.
Yeah.
Like, it's wrong in and of itself, and it's just going to cause more refugees and more problems. And we can resolve this, like you said. Prevention is better than cure. Like, let's stop the catastrophe before it gets going, and that's what I'm trying to do. That is why I'm an anti-war person. It's not just like, oh, war's bad, people die. It's like all the problems that happen after the war is done for decades continue, and you can stop all that by avoiding the violence in the first place.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well,
I want to close out by saying fuck Starbucks. And one more thing, one last thing.
Yeah.
If you guys have a Kinko's or a printer or something in your house, I want you to print out a big sign that says Vimeo Steals. And you go out to your street corner, whatever, it says Vimeo Steals. People ask you about it, say, they took $5,000 from Ryan Dawson, and they take all your movies, and just I want people all over the United States, Canada, wherever you live, with Vimeo steel signs, because these guys are having they just stole $5,000,
Yeah.
right, and censored my channel, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna make sure that no one uses you again.
I talked to a guy, actually, Chase Rachels. He did this whole thing on, I guess it was GoFundMe or one of those crowdfunding sites, and
I got kicked from that too.
Got kicked off, just lost his money. It's like, nah, sorry.
Well, with that one, when I got kicked off GoFundMe, they at least refunded the people who donated. With Vimeo, they just took the profits. Like, people bought movies, they're not allowed to watch them, and I didn't get the money either. They only refunded people from October. They waited till October 31st, right, the day before payday, and then they ovened me, and then they told everyone, if it's not in the last 30 days, you can't get a refund. So if you bought it October 1st, too late. October 2nd, by the time it's November 1st, and so on like that, you didn't get it. And then all of September, which I was not paid for and was my biggest month, they did not get refunded, and I did not get paid, which is totally illegal. I also didn't break any guidelines. They just said my criticism of Israel had an overall mean-spirited vibe.
Right. Well, maybe we can have you back on and talk about what to do with these big tech companies. It's certainly a big
Oh yeah,
problem.
I have some ideas, and I'm building my own independent everything, and everyone's welcome. Even Milo, even fucking Jigsaw Face, Laura Loomer, whatever. You can come. I will woodshed you with argument or whatever, probably, but you'll have a place where you will not get censored, and you can say whatever you want. But if you start saying shit about me, I will reply. But that's how it's supposed to be, the war of ideas. Yeah, exactly.
Very good.
Appreciate this, man. Nice interview.
Yep.
Send me this after you have it downloaded or whatever.
You got it.
It's awesome, man. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on. Bye.